The Byte Show is listener supported at thebyteshow.com.
Here we go. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes with the Byte Show, and I know you know that familiar laughter. We have Joseph P. Farrell with us, and you can access his website at Giza, Giza, deathstar.com. And tonight we're going to kind of wing it on the magic of social engineering. Hi, Joseph.
Hi, George. Thanks for having me back on. I don't know when we don't wing it.
Oh, that's true. Oh. Well, you have some announcements to make.
Yeah, actually quite a few. And right off the top of the bat, I really, truly want to thank everybody that has made donations, especially that one dear lady, and you know who you are. And the reason I especially underline the thanks right now is that, as you know, I've just really been slammed.
Yes.
would be the best way of putting it, with just so many things, GeorgeAnn, projects to get done, and some very expensive, costly research on. I'm currently writing no less than 3 books at the same time.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and a couple of them have been in some subjects that are pretty heavy on the research. In other words, they're demanding on research materials, and like most of my books, it's not. The research is not the sort of stuff that you can just go on the internet and get for free. And
yeah.
So I've got those projects going, and then on top of that, a couple of other very major projects. And
these are big.
These
projects.
are these are big, and so I wanted to make very, very sure and certain that all those sent donations know how very truly grateful I am, because many of these things just I quite honestly wouldn't be able to do them, and I wish I had time to sit down and thank each and every person by name. I don't, and that kind of ties into the second announcement, and that is I've also been involved with my webmaster making over my website, remaking it, I guess I should say.
Yes.
So, you know, everybody that listens to the show, I don't know if they're aware of it or not, but I have completely changed the website, the look of it, the feel of it, and that was about 3 weeks ago that we began this process. In that amount of time, the website has had over 50,000 hits. And, you know, that's in 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And, the other thing I need to let people know is, even though I can't respond to all of your comments and emails and everything, that I have been trying to read them all. And again, I'm grateful for the people that took the time to look things over and send comments and give responses and so on. What I'm trying to do is to diversify my income stream a little bit, because, as you know, as everybody knows, the times are very hard. And
yes.
But one thing that people should be aware of on the new website is that there is now a functioning bookstore on the website, so that people can get all of my books directly off my website. So it's no longer necessary to go to Amazon, even though the orders will be placed through Amazon off of my website. But if they place them on my website, it does give me just a teeny little bit more money. I don't know why or how that works, but it's some sort of program that Amazon has, but that's the other new feature. And kind of the third thing I wanted to mention to people is that eventually I'm hoping to have a little subscribers area or members only area on the website for a very small fee, and then I'm going to put videos and papers, and I hope eventually to do some sort of online internet conferences with people that they can subscribe to and interact directly with me. So, there's a lot of things that we've got in the works. So, in addition to all the projects and research and everything else, I've really been slammed. And again, I just do so deeply appreciate everybody that has made donations, because it wouldn't be possible to be doing all of this if it hadn't been for all of you. And I want to thank everybody and to say God bless you all.
Oh, well, Joseph, social engineering, has anything new cropped up in that arena?
Well, when we started this series, we realized it was probably going to be a series that would go on for quite a while. Mm-hmm. And the difficulty with it is that it is a field that has been written about rather extensively in the last 30 to 40 years, as people investigating the shenanigans of the CIA and some of the other intelligence agencies, and in addition to that, in a much more major way, major corporations. If you want to think of social engineering, just look at Madison Avenue and the influence and effect that commercial advertising has had on Western culture.
Oh yes.
Certainly not just in this country, but Europe and Canada and Australia. It's had a major impact on the formulation of people's opinions and how they think. And there, when you press deeper, and again, I'm kind of going around, as I usually do,
yes.
going around Harvey's barn to answer a very short question in the longest possible fashion. It reminds me of the old blooper, that the announcer said everybody is amazed as he plays passages of ease with the greatest of difficulty. But anyway, there has been a lot of stuff written, and there's always new things coming out. So it's really kind of a case of just trying to keep up with everything. But the way I like to look and show people some of the things that go on in social engineering, and one thing that we haven't talked about yet is something called perception management. And that is something I touched upon very briefly in Roswell and the Reich. Because if you look at the field of ufology, of the study of UFOs and the associated phenomena that go with them, you really do have a case where, at least insofar as the United States is concerned, and certainly I think you could say the same of the United Kingdom and some of the European powers, is you have a case where there has always been a persistent intelligence and military interest, not only in the phenomenon, but in the groups reporting it. All right?
Yeah. And
you certainly have people, scholarly people like Dr. Jacques Vallée and Mr. Richard Dolan, whose work I greatly respect, because he's kind of like me. He's an Oxford-educated historian, and his whole approach to studying UFOs is through the study of official documents and what they indicate. And both of these men have pointed out that the American military and intelligence agencies penetrated many independent UFO groups for the express purpose of manipulating or managing the perception of the phenomenon itself, all right? And if we go back to something that I said in Roswell and the Reich in one of our interviews, I certainly said it in the book, and that is that event in particular was an event where perceptions were very carefully managed.
Yes.
And what I mean by that is if you look at the earliest versions of the Roswell story, both of the two earliest versions were put out by the American military.
Yeah.
You had the first version being the military recovered a crashed flying saucer, all right? And then mere hours later, they put out the ridiculous story that what was recovered was merely a weather balloon, and it had been mistaken for a flying saucer, okay?
Yeah.
So in other words, what the military did is it set up what I call the Roswell dialectic. It set up an interpretive channel where you either had to interpret it as something extraterrestrial and extraordinary or something absolutely trivial and mundane. There was no middle ground. There was, in other words, it was that middle ground that they wanted to keep you from looking at, all right?
Yeah.
That's perception management. And I can think of, in terms of the UFO phenomenon in general, let's look at another type of social engineering or another type of perception management. And, you know, we've headed this series as Alchemy and the Magic of Social Engineering. And that raises the question of what does alchemy have to do with it? If you recall something we said very early on in this series, alchemy is not only the process of producing the philosopher's stone, it's also the process of transforming human consciousness. In other words, it's a process, to a certain extent, of managing perception. All right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's do a little kind of word association here.
Okay.
And we're all familiar with the Rorschach ink blot test. You know, you're shown basically a picture of an ink blot. And you're supposed to tell the psychologist the first thing that pops into your head. You're not supposed to think about it. You're just supposed to react. All right? Well, word association works much the same way. You're not supposed to think about the word I throw out. You're just supposed to react. All right? So let's try a little experiment. And the word I'm going to throw out there is the word, I'm going to throw two words out there, actually. I'm going to throw out the word UFO, and then I'm going to throw out the words flying saucer.
Okay.
Now, I'll bet that when most of the listeners heard those words, subconsciously they made the immediate association to extraterrestrials.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah, there you go, you see.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that to me is a very clever bit of perception management that has been going on in the UFO community for quite a long time. And it's one that, if we go back to the earliest involvements of intelligence agencies and of the militaries of the world that follow the UFO phenomenon, particularly in the case of the United States and Great Britain, the perception has been carefully managed that immediately one thinks of something extraterrestrial. In other words, it is a perfect way to conceal behind the extraterrestrial hypothesis, to conceal the possibility of an advanced human technology that you wish to keep hidden.
Oh, yes.
And the reason I point this out, the reason I'm making such a big deal of this particular form of perception management with this particular issue is twofold. The first part of the reason is that in the very in the early 50s, mid-50s, and then on into the 60s, when the CIA's U-2 spy plane was first making its flights over the Soviet Union, of course, this thing flew so high and flew so fast that many people who saw it thought, gee, that's unusual. And what the CIA did, GeorgeAnn, is it carefully cultivated the idea that people were seeing an extraterrestrial flying saucer in order to keep the technology itself under wraps.
Yes.
That is a bona fide, true historical fact. In other words, the CIA was trying to manipulate perceptions, all right?
Yes.
Now, we have in that instance a narrow case of perception management, but let's extend the idea a little further. In the early 1950s, the CIA hosted what was called the Robertson Panel, and this was a panel that was drawn of scientific and military experts simply to make a study and recommendations on CIA policy concerning UFOs. And again, Richard Dolan's books are a wonderful source for discussion of this panel. But one of the things that is very interesting to me, GeorgeAnn, and this is the second thing I wanted to mention in this idea of perception management, is that the Robertson panel recommended a broad use of the UFO phenomenon in psychological operations. All right? So in other words, the perception was not limited simply to the idea that a certain phenomenon, the U-2 flights, were to be covered over with a flying saucer story. What they're getting at in the Robertson panel is that they want to create a whole culture revolving around the idea of extraterrestrial visitation through flying saucers and what have you.
Yes.
Now, mind you, I'm not saying that some UFOs may not be extraterrestrial. That's not what I'm saying, because I'm certainly not opposed to the idea of extraterrestrial life forms. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I am saying is that with this issue in particular, you have a soft form of social engineering through a technique of managing people's understandings of what it is they're seeing by excluding from their thinking, from their reactions to these things, the idea that it could be a human technology. In other words, you're creating an entire cultural mindset about certain things. Now, let's go to the third step then, and I know I'm just jawing on endlessly.
That's okay.
So you just jump in anytime. But there's a third extension that we can give, and again, I'm using the UFO issue as kind of an example of how you might be able to do this with just about anything. Okay, but
okay.
I'm concentrating on UFOs simply to kind of tie things together with things that we've said in the other series on Roswell and the Reich. And that is, if you take this idea of perception management and extend it to the idea of creating a kind of a culture surrounding a general issue, then the third stage is you're going to start creating tangential phenomena and aspects of that culture. One of the biggest right now within ufology is the issue of so-called disclosure.
Oh, yes.
That we're on the verge. If you watch some of these UFO bulletin boards and internet sites, what they're constantly talking about is disclosure. Disclosure is just around the corners. The governments of the world, there's pressure building on the governments of the world to come clean and tell us about their decades-long contact with extraterrestrials and back engineering crashed flying saucers and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, what they've done from one point of view, GeorgeAnn, is they've created a kind of secular religion. Because what you have with disclosure, in my opinion, in many cases, is an attitude of almost messianic expectation. All right,
yes, yeah.
It's a new substitute. It's a new kind of secularized substitute for these old standard religions. Where you're expecting the Messiah if you're Jewish, or the Imam Mahdi if you're a Muslim, or the second coming of Christ if you're a Christian, so on and so forth. Disclosure functions in much the same way, at least sociologically and psychologically, within that very large UFO community that those other things do in a more traditional culture. So in other words, part of perception management and social engineering is that they are creating a new kind of religious matrix, to put it bluntly,
yes,
by which to manipulate people. And to me, it's never made much sense, GeorgeAnn, to expect the governments of the world to come clean on such an issue, because many of these people that are expecting disclosure are the same people that exhibit wholesale distrust and cynicism towards the governments of the world. So, my attitude is, well, if you distrust the government that much, even if they did disclose anything, why would you trust what they say?
Good point.
so you see, you're kind of in a catch-22 that no matter what evidence may be presented, you really have created a system of perception management such that an expectation or a fulfillment of the expectation of disclosure can never really happen. And that, in essence, is kind of the same thing that you have in religion, because, you've got constant expectations being drummed up, and when those don't happen,
yes.
They are explained away, and the perception, the expectation continues. So this, to me, is a very alarming thing, particularly in an issue like UFOs, where there is so much philosophically and technologically at stake. Because when you've created that kind of culture, when you've created that kind of climate of perception of things, then any real examination of issues and discussion of issues is foreclosed.
Yes.
It's just like I said, when I say the words UFO or flying saucer, what do you think of? Well, most people subconsciously will think immediately of something extraterrestrial.
Mm-hmm.
It's only when you stop to think that you realize that there's no logical connection, none whatsoever, between the word UFO and the word extraterrestrial.
Yeah.
There's no logical connection whatsoever. There's nothing that compels from one to the other. So, these are very, very soft forms of social engineering. In other words, I call them soft forms because they're based not on any hardware. They're not based on any technological imposition. They're simply based on techniques of manipulating the popular consciousness by infiltrating agents provocateurs into groups and so on, and then slowly and carefully and deliberately and patiently inculcating ideas and expectations and perceptions in a certain direction.
Sounds rather ominous.
It is. It is.
And it's dangerous.
Well, of course it's dangerous, because look how successful they have been in the UFO situation, in the UFO community.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not trying to cast aspersions on that community. I'm simply trying to say that it is a community that has a certain kind of creed. And what I'm trying to say is that many aspects of that creed have been the deliberate creations of intelligence agencies and militaries with something to hide, and it isn't E.T.
Yeah.
So, if they can be that successful in something that is, so to speak, off the beaten track, imagine how successful they are with manipulating perceptions on a much more mundane basis.
Oh, yes. Well, Joseph, if there are ETs in flying saucers, surely they would make themselves known, and the U.S. military would not have any control over them.
Well, this is another thing. You see, this is another kind of subtle, in my opinion, subtle perception management. Because if you look at UFO sighting cases,
yes,
it, to me, does appear that whoever is flying around in these things, that they do want to be seen.
Yes.
And that they do want to be seen to possess a technology that outclasses anything, supposedly, that human beings can throw at them. Now, that said, I'm not convinced that humanity does not have extraordinarily sophisticated and secret technologies.
Oh, my gosh, yes.
But, that's the first thing. The second thing is that I think is something missed in terms of UFOs and perception management and the whole idea of social engineering connected with it, is that if you look at the behavior of UFO occupants that supposedly have contact with humanity.
Yes.
If you look at all of these stories dating back as early as the 1950s, you know, with George Van Tassel and George Adamski and some of the early contactees, on through the 60s with Betty and Barney Hill, and then into the 70s and 80s with the little gray aliens and the gruesome medical experiments, and then into the 90s with people, you know, claiming abductions and having children, hybridized children, you know, the whole nightmare scenario that has taken place since the very earliest stories of contact with alleged ETs.
Right.
If you look at this, GeorgeAnn, the other thing that emerges is the behavior of the so-called extraterrestrial is just downright bizarre. It cannot be fit neatly or snugly into any box of human morality or human psychological analysis or anything remotely of the sort, all right? Mm-hmm. We are looking, in other words, at such a puzzling behavior that the puzzle itself, in my opinion, is meant to be a form of social engineering. In other words, what I'm suggesting is that there are human beings behind many of these abduction tales, and that they are, again, manipulating perceptions in a certain way to, in my opinion, to create a moral ambiguity in the culture surrounding ufology, and to create a feeling of helplessness and passivity.
Yes.
Before this phenomenon, whatever it may be. And again, I'm not ruling out ETs, I'm not ruling out any sort of spiritual phenomenon that may be involved here. I'm not ruling any of that out. But I am saying that some of this activity, to me, smacks suspiciously of very subtle forms of perception management and social engineering.
Well, from reports, the so-called ETs have not one shred of human compassion.
Right. Right. And this, you know, this to me is part of the mystery. In other cases of these contacts, and again, it's something that strongly suggests that there is a human element manipulating the phenomenon and engineering perceptions. And that's because in many cases of abductions or of contact, and contact is a slightly different phenomenon than abduction, but in both of those cases, many of the people contacted are given messages to either join some religious group or cult, if you will.
Yes.
And in some cases, they're simply given a message to give to humanity. And in particular, I'm thinking of George Adamski in that regard, because, you know, he was told, you know, to spread the message of love and kindness, peace and harmony that the Space Brothers were bringing to him, you know. Well, again, this activity doesn't smack so much of ET to me as it does of human beings behind the scenes manipulating a phenomenon to plant certain perceptions in the wider culture, and then to take any perception of the UFO phenomenon and steer it in a certain direction. So, yeah, I tend to agree with you. Much of the morality is inhuman, but on the other hand, you're also dealing with a moral conflict, because in some cases these messages are quite benign.
Yeah.
So you're again dealing with a phenomenon that is intended, in my opinion, or designed to send conflicting messages. And again, that puts you in a state of perception management, because one of the goals of perception management is, in some cases, to inhibit a person's ability to think critically, and then to take decisions and to be able to act upon those decisions. In other words, you're paralyzing people.
Yeah. What about Joseph, these things where cattle and human beings have been abducted and mutilated?
Mutilated?
Yes.
That is an excellent question, and it's a phenomenon I know that there has been a lot written about. I have not read that deeply into it.
Mm-hmm.
So my answer, bear with me here, because understand my answer is me crawling out a little bit on a limb and speculating off the top of my head without a great deal of familiarity with the subject.
Okay.
But again, the phenomenon strikes me as being another case of perception management in two ways. Because, first of all, there is nothing in these mutilations themselves that necessarily compel to the idea that you must associate it, once again, with extraterrestrials.
Right.
And yet, within the culture that, the alternative research culture that does examine this phenomenon, the immediate perception in many cases amongst some of those researchers is that we have here an activity of extraterrestrials. All right.
Yeah.
So I think in that case you're dealing with a bit of perception management, but then you do have serious researchers that have all along suspected that this phenomena is a result of the activity either of some sort of occult groups, or that it's the activity of the military in some bizarre program of some sort.
Yeah.
I tend to the latter view simply because the technologies evidenced in, particularly in cattle mutilations, but in the few instances where there have been human beings that have been murdered in that fashion, in those cases, there is clear evidence of a technology in play to be able to do the things that are reported. All right?
Well, like draining every blood cell from the body.
Yeah, exsanguination and
Yeah.
Surgical precision, cutting out the rectum and the eyeballs and so on and so forth that are oftentimes reported and associated with those events.
Yes.
And doing so with extremely neat surgical precision.
Yes.
As if they had been using laser scalpels and so on and so forth.
Yes.
All of this to me points to, there's nothing about the technology or the technological signatures here that compels to the idea that extraterrestrials are doing this. You do have reports of, in some of these mutilations, ranchers seeing glowing balls of light and so on. In other words, UFOs in their lands.
Kind of like Foo Fighters.
Yeah, kind of like Foo Fighters, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then the next day, they find a cow or bull has been mutilated, or in some of the other cases, a horse even.
Yeah.
I think, again, a glowing ball of light isn't beyond the ability of human technology to engineer.
You're right.
You see, so in other words, again, there's nothing that, in terms of the perception of the event, there's nothing in it that, to me, prohibits the idea that the whole thing has been engineered for some purpose, and part of that purpose is to create a climate, a culture of helplessness before some very bizarre activity, and to cloak whatever the real purpose of that activity is, to cloak that real purpose behind this utterly bizarre perception of it.
Well, I wonder what would happen. There have been mutilations where ranchers have seen helicopters.
Oh, yes, yes.
Lifting up an animal or lowering an animal. And I just wonder what would happen if a few bullets were put into the rotor blades.
Yeah. Well, it's, stories like that are only, as far as I'm concerned, confirmation that you are dealing with a purely human phenomenon. It's of human origin.
Yes.
And that the whole idea of extraterrestrials and so on and so forth and some sort of advanced technology and bizarre agenda have been injected into it to cloak whatever the real activity is and accomplish kill two birds with the same stone and accomplish yet another social engineering transformation and inducing yet another element of a feeling of helplessness before the bizarre into popular culture. I think that's really exactly what we have going on. Because there are certain parallels. I mean, you look at UFOs, you look at cattle mutilations, you look at crop circles, and in each case of these very, very different phenomena, you have a stage where an unusual phenomenon is reported, but it's not associated in any sense with the unearthly. All right,
yeah.
It's just a bizarre phenomenon. But very quickly, the phenomenon becomes attached to or associated with the unearthly, with the extraterrestrial, with the occult, with the activity of spirit beings, and so on and so forth. And I think that it is that coupling of those phenomena to those types of explanations that, again, to me, suggests the strong hand that somebody is engineering the perception of them to fit a much larger agenda.
Well said. With the little grays,
yes.
Do you think it's possible that bodies are being engineered or have been engineered to provide housing, if you will, for spirits or artificial intelligence?
Well, I haven't given much thought to the subject of the Greys or, quite frankly, any of the other supposed aliens or extraterrestrials that people report having been in contact with.
Mm-hmm.
But it is an interesting question, and it is a question that, again, might go to some of this social engineering of perceptions.
Yes.
Because let's look at the historic. Let's just examine this question historically, and then we'll examine it scientifically, or at least pseudo-scientifically. Okay. But the historical progression is also very interesting to me. In the 1950s, we have people like GeorgeAnn and Van Tassel and so on and so forth, claiming that they were contacted by extraterrestrials.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you read those men, the extraterrestrials are fully and 100% human. All right?
Yeah.
And in Adamski's case, you're not dealing with somebody that's floated out of his bed in the middle of the night on a beam of light up into a flying saucer where gruesome medical experiments are performed on him. Okay?
Yeah.
What you have is a case of a man who claims to, in many cases, to have been contacted in bold daylight in public places like restaurants or hotels.
Yeah.
And then taken up into the mothership, that's in orbit around the Earth, and he sits around a conference table with these other very human beings, and they have a nice talk, okay? That's all that happens.
Yes.
And these human beings quite oftentimes are very Nordic looking, all right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's the origin of that group, all right? Then by the time you get to Betty and Barney Hill, away go the cordial meetings in the sky around conference tables and tea. What you now have are full, honest-to-goodness kidnappings, all right, of strange little creatures that, in Barney Hill's case, he says, well, they look like Nazis, That's that's his description of them. And then by the 70s and 80s, you have a complete change from the early days of the contactees to now full-fledged abductions where people are literally being kidnapped and having horrible experiments done to them, like the old medieval tales of the incubus and the succubus.
Yes.
And so on and so forth. So there has been an elaboration of the story, all right? And again, it's interesting to me that the elaboration has gone in the direction of bizarre behavior that cannot be rationalized from any standpoint of human morality or behavior, and a pseudo-technological or quasi-technological context in which all of this occurs, inducing a feeling of helplessness in the victims that have undergone it, all right?
Yes.
And in some cases, these victims are and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that I don't think that what these people went through was not real.
Yes.
The only thing I'm questioning is the perception of it.
Absolutely.
Why does it necessarily have to be something extraterrestrial? It might be spiritual. It might be some sort of elaborate psychological operation that other human beings are carrying out. Who knows? But it's the perception of it as being consistently extraterrestrial that bothers me. It is, to me, again, showing all the hallmarks of perception management. But let's get to the Greys. In most of the stories that I've read, GeorgeAnn, I'm struck with two facts. And that is if these creatures exist, and I'm by no means certain that they do. I don't care how many stories about them are out there. That's my point. They're stories, and there's very little corroboration, and there's too much potential for confabulation.
Yes.
But if we grant, for the sake of argument, that these things are real, that they exist, the first thing, GeorgeAnn, that strikes me is, pardon me, that they do not, to me, seem to have a physiology that would make them adaptable for life on another planet. They seem to be more physiologically adaptable to life underground on a more or less permanent basis right here on planet Earth, because of the large eyes, the pallid gray skin, and so on and so forth. They, in other words, the environment that they seem to be most suited for isn't living on a planetary surface somewhere, but under a planetary surface, and probably this one. All right?
Okay.
The second thing that strikes me is that the behavior of these things, again, it's a kind of a hive-like behavior as far as I've been able to determine, because you usually have a leader of the group, and then the rest of them basically show no emotions. They just go about their task and perform things, and that's it. And they don't seem to be conscious or emotionally involved either with each other or with what they're doing. They're just performing a task.
Yes.
So I'd hesitate on that basis to say that you're dealing with creatures that are persons in any sense like you and I understand the term. They appear to be kind of hollow, little genetically engineered robots. So yeah, my response to your question is I'm more willing to entertain that idea, that these are a genetically engineered creation, than they are anything else. But if they're not genetically engineered, then like I say, they're a life form that appear to be more adapted to subterrestrial origins rather than extraterrestrial origins.
Speaking of subterrestrial, what about the Antarctic?
What do you mean?
Wasn't there an opening there to the inside of the Earth?
Well, personally, I'm not a person that places any stock in those stories of big holes open at the poles, or the North Pole or the South Pole. There's always been a certain kind of fringe group, Hollow Earth group, that thinks that Admiral Byrd, when he went down to Antarctica in late 46 and early 47 with Operation High Jump, that he actually found the opening to that pole and discovered another civilization, and they kicked him out of there, and so on and so forth. I don't believe that at all. I do think that something mighty peculiar happened on that expedition.
Yes.
For the simple reason that we were told, and again, let's look at the story of the holes in the poles and Admiral Byrd encountering another civilization. Well, again, I think that itself might be a form of perception management, of creating an entirely unearthly and ultimately kind of irrational explanation for something that otherwise would be scrutinized fairly closely if people were not turned off by the irrational explanation. All right? Follow me?
Yeah.
So I think in stories like that, again, you have to be very careful about sifting through the explanations for them. And that explanation, I think, is an explanation that has been designed to deflect attention from the anomalies in the real story. And those anomalies are very interesting because Admiral Byrd and that expedition, we were told, the public story was they were going down there to conduct winter training and equipment tests.
Yes.
All right? Well, this is nonsense on the face of it because you don't need to mount a full-scale naval and marine military expedition to Antarctica to conduct winter training and tests of winter equipment. You can go to Alaska or the Canadian Arctic for that, and it's a lot less expensive and it's a lot more accessible.
Yes.
So the cover story on the face of it to me is ridiculous. So what's the real purpose of going to Antarctica? And the only thing, GeorgeAnn, in the historical record that makes any connection or gives a solid basis for that is the fact that, of course, in the late 1938 and then early 39, the Nazis sent an expedition to Antarctica. And we don't know really to this day what they were doing there or why they went there. Because once they got back to Germany, of course, they made the newsreels and paraded them around as national heroes, and they were given medals by Reich Marshal Goering and, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
But then you never heard about it. It went completely black.
Yes.
The whole subject just sort of dropped off the face of the earth. Now, it is interesting, and what most people don't realize is that before the Nazis launched that expedition, they actually requested and received advice in person from Admiral Byrd.
Yes.
He went there. He told the Germans, what to expect and how to outfit their expedition and so on and so forth. In other words, he gave them the full benefit of his own experience in polar regions. So there is this Nazi-Byrd connection prior to the war. And of course, to me, that only heightens the suspicion in my mind that whatever the purposes of his expedition were, they had something to do with that pre-war Nazi expedition to Antarctica. They had nothing to do with finding holes in the poles and another, hollow earth and all of those things. To me, those stories are the perception management.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a big story, and Admiral Byrd, to put the icing on the cake, when Admiral Byrd was returning from Antarctica, he gave that interview to El Mercurio newspaper in Santiago de Chile, and the reporter's name that interviewed him was Leo Venata, all right, and I even reproduced the actual newspaper article from that newspaper. It's in Spanish, of course, but I reproduced it in Reich of the Black Sun so that you can see that I'm not making this up.
Yes.
But Admiral Byrd is quoted in the article as saying that the United States has to prepare to defend itself against enemy fighters that can fly from pole to pole with tremendous speed. That's exactly what the article says. So Byrd gets back to this country. His diaries, the operational logs from that operation, are classified to this day. So in other words, folks, any diary out there that you may find on the Internet claiming to be Admiral Byrd's classified diaries, talking about holes in the poles and all of this, no. Those diaries are still classified. What you're dealing with on the Internet is either disinformation or simply an outright hoax.
Yeah, conjecture.
Conjecture, hoax, whatever.
Yeah.
Because the actual operational logs are still buried. And I suspect they will be buried for a long time, because I strongly suspect that whatever he ran into down there, it may have had something to do with these Nazis and some of their research activities. So again, it's a case of perception management.
Yeah. Well, throughout South America and Mexico, there have been sightings of weird creatures.
Yes.
Sometimes they're very intimidating. Other times they just make an appearance.
Yes.
And poof, they vanish. Joseph, could these be products of the Nazis?
Well, I don't know if one can say could they be products of the Nazis, but I do think we have to hold open the possibility that they're the products of a human technology.
Yes.
As to what particular group is behind them, that's another story. But the reason I say that, again, and again, we're dealing, I think, with yet another example of some possible perception management. Because you and I both know that you can go online and literally do searches for genetic engineering or manimals or chimeras or whatever, and pull up a whole slew of articles on what geneticists are proposing to do. All right, and they come right out and tell you that they want to engineer hybrid life forms, and they have already done so. This is old news. So the technology that we're exposed to is usually about 20 to 30 years behind the curve of what's actually going on. So it wouldn't surprise me. I hold it open as a possibility that, they may be creating some weird and fantastic creatures, and for whatever reason, either letting them loose or the creatures are getting loose. And in order to control the perception of what's going on, is they're creating fantastic legends, or they're tying these creatures to legends that already exist.
Yes.
All right. And that's not to say that there aren't weird creatures out there in the world that zoology and biology don't know anything about, because there certainly are.
Well, a news story broke that the Jason Group has advised the Pentagon to take the DNA of every soldier for various purposes. It's just, there's just so much going on in genetics.
Yes. Now, there's so much going on that you can't rule this out. And again, it's, if you look at what I just said, it's the same playbook that they used with UFOs, and in my opinion, that they used with Roswell. Because what you have is, in my opinion, a fully human technology that is years, if not decades, in advance of what the public knows.
Yes.
All right?
Yes.
And in order to deflect any attention from anyone that might be inclined to research or examine these reports from the standpoint that they do represent a human technology, you create a deep cover of disinformation. You create a perception management scenario in which any instance like this is immediately interpreted along bizarre paradigms, extraterrestrials or chupacabras or what have you, because they don't want you looking at the technology. Because once you start looking at the technology, once you start thinking in terms that this is human, then you start questioning the activity that the technology represents, and what are they doing this activity for?
Well, they now it's come out that they want to bring back the mammoth.
Yes. I in fact, I even posted an article on my website about that.
Yeah.
You know, they want to bring back the woolly mammoth, clone a woolly mammoth, which, you know, fine and dandy, but, you know, it's not going to stop there.
Of course not.
You know, so, you know, you're looking at a real Jurassic Park scenario, and in my opinion, what's really going on, and this is where I think the social engineering and the alchemy and perception management and all of this kind of come together. If we look at all of the technological advances within the last 100 years, particularly within the realm of physics and within the realm of genetics, when you put it all together, GeorgeAnn, what it looks to me is really going on, and I'm going to crawl way out on a limb with this one.
Okay.
It looks to me as if there is a hidden hand of some sort, a group, a fraternity, a club, a secret society, I don't know what you want to call it. But it looks to me as if there is a hidden hand that has been attempting through technological means to recreate or to create a fulfillment of the old mythologies.
Yeah.
Yeah. In other words, we are looking at, in my opinion, very possibly a very, very, very old agenda. And in fact, if you go back to what I said in my book, The Cosmic War, and something I hinted at in that series of interviews that we did,
yeah,
one of the things I have always maintained, and what I've been doing in the books that I've been writing on ancient stuff since The Cosmic War, is in that book I maintained that essentially, as in any war, at the end of the war, particularly if it's a destructive one, you have surviving elites on both sides that are going to attempt to recover to the state of civilization that they were at before the war.
Yes.
And there are going to be various motivations in each of these groups for doing so. All right? I think that if you look at it that way, you are dealing possibly with, at the minimum, two elites that survived that ancient cosmic war, and they've been trying ever since then to push civilization back to the point of technological sophistication that it was in when it fought that war.
Oh, yes.
And when you read the texts, the ancient texts, they're very clear. You have persistent and consistent statements of technological sophistication in two realms, in the realm of physics and in the realm of genetics. Over and over and over, I don't care what text you read, you can read the Mesopotamian Enuma Elish, or you can read the Mayan Popol Vuh.
Yeah.
But essentially you're dealing with some very astonishing assertions, and when you read behind the mythological language, what you're dealing with are technologies in those two areas. So it appears to me that behind all of this modern activity to create fantastic flying technologies and fantastically destructive weapons and weird genetic chimerical creations and so on and so forth,
yeah,
in every instance you can look at these creations and tie them to some sort of ancient mythological text. I mean my word. I just posted an article on my website about invisibility technology. All right?
Yes.
And, you can go online and pull up all sorts of articles again. I mentioned only 2, but, there are literally thousands of them. And in the article, I pointed out that this is now such a mainstream area of technological research that even Dover Publications has now published a little book called Geometry and Light, and the subtitle is The Science of Invisibility. I've got the book.
Oh, my.
And it's a heavily mathematical book.
Yes.
But the point is that there's real hard science and technology behind this stuff. But what's most interesting to me is that one of the things I put in the article was that they are attempting to design invisibility suits.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, if that doesn't sound familiar, folks, I don't know what is, because in the old Mesopotamian epic, the Enuma Elish, which is supposedly one of the oldest creation stories in the world, predating in some aspects of the story, predating the biblical account.
Yes.
Well, what do you read? You read about Marduk being given an invisibility suit to go off and fight the goddess Tiamat.
Yes.
All right? And what's interesting to me, again, is you talk about a case of perception management. There's another one. Because if you study the Enuma Elish in the academy, they will tell you, and you're expected to buy the line, that this is an epic of creation. It's a creation mythology, right?
Yeah.
Well, anyone who's read my books, and in particular the Giza Death Star Destroyed or the Cosmic War, where I, quote long passages from this epic.
Mm-hmm.
If you sit down and actually read what it says, it's not talking about creation at all. It's talking about a war.
Yes.
And it's talking about fantastic technologies that were used to fight the war. Creation has nothing whatsoever to do with it. So in other words, that's another bit of perception management. If you think you're dealing with the mythology of creation, then you're not going to be reading this from any standpoint that you're looking at a technology here. What's ripping the veil off of that interpretation and those kinds of interpretations is that science is now making possible the technologies, the implements that you see described in a lot of these ancient mythologies. So again, that to me only indicates that there may be a hidden purpose or agenda to all of this scientific drive, that someone wants to recreate that world.
Yes.
And literally to invoke it through technological means.
And they're using man to do it.
And they're using man to do it, yes.
Oh.
And these may be other humans, they may not be, I don't know. But that's my model. And the interesting thing about the model of these two elites is thus far, as I'm doing my research and looking at all the the social engineering ramifications of it, the technological ramifications of it, and so on. The interesting thing that emerges is that the model works.
Yeah.
In other words, the model even explains that aspect of occult tradition or esoteric tradition, that you've always had two brotherhoods. You've got a white brotherhood and a black brotherhood, and they've been in conflict for millennia.
Yes.
Because they're trying to do, they're using the same science, they're using the same magic, if you will, they're using the same technology, if you will, but using it for two very different motivations. And, it looks to me like we're recreating that world.
Yeah. It certainly does.
Yeah, it certainly does.
Oh. And it was a good world if you were an elite.
Yeah, if it was a good world if you were a member of an elite, right.
It
wasn't so good if you were at the bottom of the pyramid.
Yeah, you were a slave.
You were a slave.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I've often wondered, caveman.
Mm-hmm.
I have jokingly said in the past that that they were escapees from some of the camps of these elites.
Possibly so.
Anciently. And, they drew pictures in caves of weird things.
Right. Yes, they certainly did. They certainly did.
Oh. And the Neanderthal becoming extinct the way it did.
Yeah, there are many. There are many mysteries about the relationship of Homo sapiens sapiens to Homo neanderthalensis.
Yeah.
A lot of mysteries, and in fact, I get into just a few of them in the book that's coming out, Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men. And, that's a story I'm quite convinced I'm not done writing about either.
I know.
There are so many mysteries regarding that, because geneticists, oddly enough, at one point, geneticists were convinced that there was no mixture of Neanderthal DNA in modern man, and then more recent studies have shown that there is, and it's a relatively high concentration of it.
Yeah.
In one study I read, it was as high as 4%. Well, we only share 1% of our DNA in common with chimpanzees. So, that little fact alone, if it's a fact that bears increasing scrutiny amongst scientists, if it holds up, then that fact alone is going to change dramatically all the evolutionary models, all of the paleontological and anthropological models. It's a lot is going to have to be rewritten. So it's a big, huge story, and the sudden disappearance of Neanderthalensis, and then the sudden rise of Cro-Magnon man, which has never really, to my mind, been adequately explained by any existing theory, is it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in genetics. Genetics is going to simultaneously, I think, tell a lot of this prehistorical story.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's going to, in some cases, vindicate some of the ancient texts, and in some cases, it runs so counter to some of those ancient texts. It's going to be a very, very interesting time. And in some cases, I don't think geneticists are going to come forward and come clean with the whole story either.
Yeah.
And again, that's a form of perception management. When you withhold evidence, that is manipulating perceptions.
Well, there's recently been the murder of Dr. Wheeler. He was aware of phosgene being flown to various places.
Phosgene gas?
Yes. There is just a lot of murders going on lately.
Well, yes, there certainly are, and they all seem to have suspicious circumstances surrounding them. That's a whole other story, and it may very well touch upon some of this perception management, because, it's a story I have not written about in any of my books, or even in any degree on my website. But the murder of scientists began really in the early 1980s, when people began to realize that there was a pattern to these murders. And in that earliest instance, the pattern was of scientists that were connected somehow with research for President Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, in other words, for the Star Wars program.
Yeah.
You had the murder of a number of prominent physicists and engineers and so on that were connected with that. And the initial reports suggested, or the initial analysis suggested, that this was the KGB that was doing it, because the Russians didn't want the West to get ahead of them, or to deploy this thing. My gut tells me that that's probably not a correct analysis.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
Because the Russians are no slouches when it comes to those things, and they can easily keep up. So to me, it's a little suspicious on those grounds.
Well, and a lot of what do you call it? Biological.
Well, yes, there have been
science.
biologists, there have been pathologists,
Yes.
there have been immunologists, and more
Plasma.
recently, the murder of scientists appears to have been shifting away from the field of physics and into the field of biology.
Yes.
But in any case, the pattern to me is very, very peculiar, because if you look at the scientists in question, any one of them, had they ever spoken out forcefully and publicly, could have exposed a lot of stuff.
Oh, yes.
And that to me is a very suspicious activity. That and again, perception management steps in here to write all this off as mere coincidence, and I don't think that's the case.
No, these are not mere coincidence.
No, I don't think so. Not to have them occurring in the numbers that they do. It's like arguing that all the witnesses that were connected somehow to the Kennedy assassination that died, that's all mere coincidence. Well, it was of course merely coincidence that most of those witnesses died before they had to testify before one of the investigations of the whole assassination. So yeah, it doesn't ring the coincidence bell to me.
Yeah. And that brings up the fact that you have a new book out.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that.
LBJ and the Conspiracy to Kill Kennedy.
Right.
Coalescence of Interest.
Yeah, that book just came out. It came out right toward the end of December last year. In fact, it came out so late in December that I only got my copies in early January. But that book is a part of this big story, and in fact, it is very much a book that is, in a certain way, a study of perception management, because, of course, that whole assassination thing and the Warren Commission itself, the Warren Report, was a classic study of perception management. Managing the perception and keeping a certain interpretation of an event going long enough for the perpetrators to ensure that the agendas that they wanted to achieve by committing the crime were left untouched. And it was a perception that was planted to keep the actual interests that were probably involved out of the spotlight long enough for those interests to burrow in even deeper and protect themselves over the long term.
Yes.
And I certainly think that is a whole aspect of the assassination, and that I don't know how successfully, but I at least attempt to deal with in that book. And I had my good friend Jim Mars, of course, who's written a lot about the Kennedy assassination, emailed me, and he questioned me as to whether or not I thought LBJ was the mastermind, that he orchestrated it all. No, I don't think that at all. I do think that he was involved at some level, but it's difficult to determine exactly how.
Yeah.
The real point of the book is to show that, there's a prima facie case to be made for his involvement at some level. But the real point of the book isn't so much just LBJ. It's about that coalescence of interest, because, in my opinion, when you look at the Kennedy assassination, the stark bottom line is that just about everybody that has been argued as having been at the center of the conspiracy to murder him was probably involved.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, I'm not saying that it's just the mafia. I'm not saying that it's just rogue elements within the American military-industrial complex. I'm not saying it's just elements of the anti-Castro Cubans that were functioning at the time. I'm not saying it's just Texas big oil and so on and so forth. It's actually a coalescence of all of these interests. And the key to it, and again, this is part of the perception management that I find so very interesting.
Yeah.
The key to me, the Rosetta Stone, that exhibits this fact starkly and clearly is look at the interests represented by each of the people that Lyndon Johnson appointed to be commissioners on the Warren Commission.
Mm-hmm.
Because each of those 7 men, every last one of them, represents or has connections to those very interests that other assassination researchers, ever since the event, have been arguing were involved.
Yeah.
So in other words, the commission itself was not selected to get to the bottom of the assassination. It was selected to protect the interests that were involved and to create and manage the perception of the event.
Yes. Absolutely.
And in that, you see, LBJ is involved because his selection of these men was done in close consultation with Herbert Hoover, not Herbert Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI.
Yeah.
And this means that, you know, if you're batting 1,000 and picking 7 men that represent the interests coalescing in the assassination, then this argues to at least his involvement as an accessory after the fact.
Oh, yes. Yes, yes.
At least to that level.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's an interesting book, and of course one of the things that I do in the book is that, again, taking the theme of perception management and looking at it that way in order to see the basic outlines or structure or architecture of the conspiracy itself.
Well, and you bring up a lot of occult points, too.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. Yes, I do. Because you've been reading the book.
Yes. Yes. I'm guilty. Yes.
Well, it's a principle of the occult that when you embark on a magical act that is directed at a target group or a human target, in this case the people of the United States, it is a principle that you have to let them know what you're doing.
Yes.
Otherwise, the magical act won't work.
Yeah, the occult, that's a principle.
Yes, absolutely.
That they live by. They have to tell you what they're going to do to you before they do it.
Before they do it, exactly.
Yes.
And they have to give some indication of who they are.
Yes.
Well, in the assassination, as you know from that particular chapter in the book, there are all sorts of clues.
Oh my goodness, yes.
as to who is pulling off this, you know, and I don't mean by my laughter to deny the fact that what was done there was a brutal, grisly, ghoulish act of murder.
Yes, yes it was.
And, you know, and it was a murder not just of poor President Kennedy, it was a murder of the American soul. It was an act of social engineering. It was an act to brutalize the collective consciousness of the nation. Mm-hmm. But, you know, there's all sorts of messages being sent in that assassination as to who's behind it. One of the things I take great pains to do in that book is to show that the most unlikely connection, I've been saying ever since the SS Brotherhood of the Bell, that the Nazis were involved.
Yes.
And at a deep level.
Yes.
Well, in LBJ and the Conspiracy to Kill Kennedy, I point out the connections that very few people, in fact only one other assassination researcher by the name of Peter Dale Scott, has actually uncovered, and that's the deep, deep connection between those right-wing Texas oil men, a lot of whom, of course, were big backers of, guess who, Lyndon Johnson.
Yeah.
There's a deep, deep connection between these oil men and that Nazi intelligence organization that eventually becomes West German intelligence. So, there's that. There's another interesting set of messages as to the who was behind it, in the fact that the original reporting of Oswald's rifle in that assassination was a Mauser, a German Mauser, not an Italian Mannlicher Carcano. Mm-hmm. All right. So you're given little subtle messages even with the two versions of the rifle, because one is a representative of a former Axis power, namely Italy, and the other is a representative of a former Axis power, namely Germany. And here's something I did not put into the book that most people don't realize. The Mauser in question was actually, the caliber of the weapon was actually stated by the Dallas deputy sheriffs that claimed to have found it. And it was not the same caliber as the Mauser that was used by German soldiers in World War II. It was the caliber of the Mauser that the German Mauser company allowed to be produced under license in Argentina.
Oh my gosh. Yes.
You see, so, these are little details, I realize. They're just picky little things, but you total all of the things in that book up. Mm-hmm. And what you get is exactly what Jack Ruby said it was. It was an enormously large conspiracy. It was so big that people, he said, wouldn't believe it.
Yes.
If they really knew all of the interests involved.
Oh my gosh. Well, I would advise everybody to get a copy, because...
Yes, I would too, off my website.
Yes, go to Joseph's website, GizaDeathStar.com, and get a copy of his latest book, LBJ and the Conspiracy to Kill Kennedy. Get a copy, because Joseph and I are going to do some audios on that.
Oh, okay. Okay. Surprise.
Yes, I haven't told you that.
Well, you just did.
Now I've got another question. And this goes to something about banking.
Okay.
The Vatican Bank is alleged to be holding large sums of money for various members of the Western elite.
In what form?
Money, gold. I don't know.
Okay, what's the question?
Well, how can they get away with that?
Well, I mean, the Vatican Bank is like any other bank. They're not going to turn away any group of depositors based on who they are or who they're alleged to be. The real story here, if and again, I don't know anything about the story or what you're citing here, so I'm kind of speculating.
Yes.
Off the top of my head. I'm doing my usual tap dance.
Okay.
But the real story to me is just how much gold is there.
Yes.
Number one. And if you're saying that the Vatican Bank is sitting on top of gold reserves in the amount of trillions of dollars,
mm-hmm.
to me, this is a little suspicious.
Yeah.
Well, it's more than a little suspicious, because I go back to World War II and the vast amounts of gold that the Nazis had, a lot of which is still missing.
Yes.
All right. Now, it could be, number one, that some of this gold, allegedly in the Vatican Bank, is from that missing Nazi stockpile.
Yes.
But even then, to me, GeorgeAnn, that does not really deal with the whole mystery. It is just a feeling. I am not basing what I'm about to say on any hard evidence, because I certainly don't have that at my fingertips. It's certainly something that if one were to research, one would have to research for a long time and get very, very hard data in order to argue the case that I'm about to speculate about. So please, everybody, understand I am merely speculating and nothing more.
Okay.
All right? That said, my gut intuition has been that there is more gold in play than has actually been mined. In other words, if you go back to something, and again, this fits right in with the topic of this particular series, alchemy and the magic of social engineering.
Yeah.
Because the alchemy aspect of it is, of course, that the philosopher's stone was an object, the product of an alchemical technology. It was an object that supposedly could transmute base metals into gold. All right? Now, beginning in the SS Brotherhood of the Bell, and then much more thoroughly in the book The Philosopher's Stone, I talk about the fact that between World War I and World War II, German engineers had noticed that under certain conditions, when they were performing experiments with mercury and subjecting it to various forms of stress, that they were, in fact, ending up in their samples with a minute trace amount of gold.
Yes.
And the only way that they could account for this is that some of the mercury, for some reason in their experiments, had been transmuted from mercury into gold. This reached such a fever pitch, and I want to mention something else. The nature of these experiments was not the same type of experiments that later nuclear physics did. In other words, they were not bombarding mercury with neutrons and so on and so forth, and expecting nuclear transformations like later nuclear physics would do with uranium and so on and so forth. That's not the kind of experiments they were doing.
Yes.
They were simply taking mercury and subjecting mercury to enormous amounts of electromagnetic bombardment and stress, using X-rays, using extremely high voltage direct current electricity pulses, and so on and so forth. They were not doing conventional nuclear transformation experiments. So the result of these discoveries by these German engineers, and there were some Japanese engineers, incidentally, that had run into the same phenomenon in Japan. Well, the result was, between the wars, you had a number of patents taken out in Germany by companies like no less than Siemens, all right, in patenting these transformation processes of transmuting mercury into gold. Now, you add to this another interesting phenomenon, that as the Nazi Party was in its infancy, one of its early backers was the World War I general for the Kaiser by the name of Erich Ludendorff. Ludendorff actually backed some of these alchemists at the time to the tune of 100,000 Reichsmarks to perform alchemical transformations for him. And in fact, it was such a major scandal in Germany. The man that he got to do it was tried for fraud and everything else. And it actually made a little bit of an international stir at the time. But the interesting thing is, even after this episode, the SS, once the Nazis took power, there was apparently some branch of the SS that